Hello and welcome to Heroic Media. I'm Michelle Bauman.
And I'm Patrick Cordova. This week on Heroic Media, a professor explains why Johns Hopkins University no longer prescribes sex change operations.
Heroic Media's news director Jenny Yubing takes on pet parenting.
Hundreds of Chinese women are committing suicide each day, and hardly anyone is talking about it.
Stay tuned for these stories and more here on Heroic Media.
So here at Heroic Media, we explore news headlines that deal with very foundational moral issues related to family, marriage, and life.
And the reason that we focus on those issues is that they're so fundamental, so foundational to the rest of society. And the issues we explore tend to revolve around abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, and homosexual marriage.
That's right.
So Patrick, what's our first story for today?
Okay, in our first story, a distinguished professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University shares his thoughts as to why they stopped performing sex change operations. So this topic has become very pronounced lately. A lot of the gender identity issues, and so many people are just saying, hey, it's okay, just go get sex change surgery and that will fix everything. So this particular article is several years old, right? Mm-hmm. So it was in the early 2000s. I think it was 2004. Mm-hmm. And so it's been a little while since it came out. And but I think it's still very pertinent today, which is why we're talking about it, because of the kind of seemingly explosion in all these cases, at least the media airing and talking about them, and social media, just a buzz with everything. And so this distinguished professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University, he is a distinguished service professor, and his name is Paul McHugh. And so he kind of does a good job, I think, just sharing his experience, I guess, with this issue, and kind of giving a history of it, dating back all the way to the 70s, kind of what they did about it back then, and what his experiences were, and what sorts of studies were conducted that led the university there to not perform any of those.
Right, exactly. And I think it's important that you mentioned this was written about a decade ago, because I've seen it floating around on social media. It's kind of making a comeback now because these issues are in the news a lot. Right. But it made me wonder if this professor had written this today, would he have faced backlash? Would he have, had his job in danger for writing this? It's not a popular stance to take. Yep. But at the time, he just said, hey, here's the science of it. So Johns Hopkins was actually leading the way in some respects in these sex change operations several decades ago. And they decided, okay, we're going to stop doing this. Yes. Simply not for moral reasons or any kind of religious convictions, but because of the science behind it. Right. And so one of the points he makes is that there still is not a lot of data out there on these individuals who have this desire to have a sex change, transgender. They're born a man and they want to be a woman, or vice versa. And so he's saying, well, let's actually go in and do some studies and look at these people. Yes. And the conclusion he came to was that these are people who have mental challenges or psychological challenges, and that those aren't being addressed by simply having them undergo a sex change. Yeah, exactly. And that's what they found. And I like how I don't know what his religious background is, or if he even has one. So I really appreciated kind of the step outside of any religious type of discussion or even theological discussion, although I think those are extremely important. I like that it was kind of isolated from that, so you could kind of take, hopefully, more of a scientific approach. And that's kind of what he did, because he was like, listen, the university is recommending that when we get these types of people in here, that we say the best thing for you to do is go ahead and get a sex change surgery, because that is going to fix everything. And so what he was seeing was that, well, it doesn't really seem like this is working. And so he said, let's have some official follow-ups, and let's get with these people and kind of follow them throughout their life afterwards and see if it actually did what we
think that it's going to do and said that it was going to do, and that is fix their problems, especially like a lot of interactions that they have, mental issues, etc., social issues, because they told them, hey, if you get a sex change surgery to conform to how you feel inside, even though you are a man, you feel like you need to be a woman, so if we just change all your sexual parts, then is that, surgically remove them and change them, is that going to then make you have like this wonderful life and everything's going to be hunky-dory like you imagine? So they followed these people around. There's kind of two different cases they're talking about. One was like adults where they had this feeling of gender dysphoria or whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of different names, I think, for the same thing. But and then they also did another study on infants, babies that were born that had some sort of deformed genitalia and that were boys. And so basically at the time in the 1970s, they just said, okay, what you need to do is we need to remove any identification that you're a male and then reconstruct everything so that you're female. And then you, parents, are going to change everything in this child's life and treat them as female. You're going to change their birth certificate. You're going to treat them just like you would as if they were a little girl, and they'll never know the difference because all that matters is how we treat people, and that's what determines how people are. And so it was really interesting.
Yeah, that study I thought was particularly interesting because even though these genetic boys were being raised as females, they exhibited all of these traits which are associated with boys. They were interested in just sort of roughhousing. They were interested in ice hockey. They ended up being attracted to females. And so they had this idea that you can make this person a female if you start treating her that way. Basically, that didn't work. And what this psychiatrist concluded, he said, without any fixed position on what is given in human nature, any manipulation of it can be defined as legitimate. So sort of this idea that there is no such thing as male and female, we can just make somebody whatever we want. And he's saying, no, that's not how this works, because the chromosomes in each human being, in each cell, identify you as either male or female, and even if you go and try to reconstruct the external features, that's still there. So simply by having a surgery, that doesn't change your sex. You're still male or female, and that's being shown down at the cellular level all throughout your body.
Yes, exactly. And so for that second study, the one with the babies that you're referring to, I thought that was really fascinating as well. The results of that were reported in the January 22nd, 2004 issue of the New England Journal of Medicine. So it was published in in a very popular journal. So and it was I thought it was very fascinating to see, because they followed these kids. They said, okay, we're going to do this, and then we're going to follow up with them, and we're going to see what happened to them throughout their lives. And so it was just interesting to see the breakdown, right? So two of the parents, so there's 16 total of these babies, and two of the parents said, two of the baby's parents, so two of the kids, said, no, we're not going to go through with this. Our children will be boys because, genetically that's what they are, despite any sort of, genetic complications with how they are physically. So we're just going to go ahead with that. So those two boys were indeed raised as boys. They didn't have any problem. They felt like boys, etc. I'm sure they had some, issues when they got older and understood what things should look like, etc. But the parents helped them through those things. And then for the other, the remaining 14, the breakdown, 8 out of the 14 declared that they were males. So even despite the fact, like you were talking about earlier, they had these, inside they felt like, hey, we need to be, I want a rough house, I want to do all these boy things. I don't want to play with dolls. I don't want to do any of these normally associated with girls type of things. And so 8 out of the 14, they declared themselves males despite all of this interaction and coercion from their parents and society. And then 5 were living as females, and 1 lived with an unclear sexual identity. So I think what that study shows is that, and really that's what he came to the conclusion of, which he already stated earlier, is that the genetics is really what matters. And that's what determines. In the case of the first study with the adults that have these things, it was indeed determined that it was a psychiatric problem.
Right, and that's, I think, very interesting, because gender dysphoria, the idea that you don't feel like you are the same gender that your sex shows you to be, that used to be constituted as a disorder, and since then, they've changed it. And they said, no, that's not a disorder. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just a condition. It just happens to be the way you are, but it's not a problem. And that was the opposite of what he found through the research and through the studies. What he said is, I concluded that to provide a surgical alteration to the body of these unfortunate people was to collaborate with a mental disorder rather than to treat it. And the solution is to go through the psychiatric process, to go through the psychological process, and help these people realign their understanding of themselves with reality.
Exactly. And so that's what I got out of it. The ultimate conclusion was that the outcome of this study shows that we need to address these people like psychologically and not tell them, let's get some surgery, because ultimately they're not going to end up being happy. They're still going to have the same problems.
Exactly.
All right.
Coming up after the break, we'll talk dog moms and cat dads.
Stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to Heroic Media. In case you're just joining us, I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman. For this segment, we're pleased to be joined by Heroic Media's news director, Jenny Eubing. Jenny, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So you recently wrote a blog that had a very heated response. And basically what you argued in this blog is, hey, animals are not the same as humans, and this whole idea of pet parenthood is a problem because we need to stop equating having a child with having a pet. Can you describe the response your blog got?
Yeah, I was surprised because it was a uniquely gentle tone, I think, for the voice that I tend to project. But yeah, I had an experience in Whole Foods on Mother's Day and just overheard an exchange between two young women who were congratulating each other on their babies, which were dogs. And I just thought, gosh, that's something I'd like to dig into a little. So I spent a little time explaining, like, while there's like a beautiful companionship that a human and an animal can enjoy, it's not like an equitable relationship to a parent-child. But it's really a trend that has kind of gained some momentum recently. Like one of the big national pet store brands has like a pet moms and pet dads campaign that they really were pushing hard around Mother's Day, and maybe it'll come back into the rotation for Father's Day. But the response was pretty aggressive from some people. There were really a few people who took offense at the idea that their pet was not on an equal footing with somebody else's child, like a human child. And that was surprising.
Yeah, that's pretty, yeah. I mean, I know some people who are like very like obsessed with their pets and do treat them as children, just like you were saying. Why do you think that's the reason why it struck such a nerve, or why do you think it struck such a nerve?
I mean, first of all, I do believe that there's like legitimate like love for animals. And I think that's like a very Christian understanding of, you know, creation, and it is right and good to love and care for and nurture this thing. But contraception has actually made it possible for people to kind of like dip a toe in and experiment with parenthood. I had quite a few people tell me, well, I'm just practicing. Like, it's so great that women have the freedom to put off motherhood for a while and they can still have something to love. And I thought, oh, that's really telling of like a deeper undercurrent of a real anti-child mentality. And I mean, I have, you know, 3, almost 4 kids myself, and as much as I would like to, some nights you cannot put your kid in the garage when it's up in the middle of the night, okay? And you can't lock them, you can't crate them when they're barking.
You could, but then you'd be taking away their social services.
I guess there are probably certain, So, but there were just some like qualitative differences that did not translate well for a lot of people. There was like such a heated level of emotion that it was difficult to cut through that and say, look, there's a good, which is loving an animal, but there's a greater good, which is loving and having a reciprocal relationship with a human being.
And I guess that would be the difference between loving an animal and, you know, loving another person, right? Like that's where, like, because people will say, I love my animal, but I think you just kind of illustrated what the difference is. Right?
There's this like give and take. There's this, I mean, the idea of not being able to put affection into a container that wasn't designed to contain it, if that makes sense. You can't, as much as you like selflessly love your dog, you really can still kick it to the kennel and take off for a 2-week vacation. It doesn't have an immortal soul, and it doesn't actually care as long as you show up at the same time every night and give it food. Right. You know, even though some dogs do have great personalities.
Jenny, how would you respond to an infertile couple that says, you know, we have pets because we can't have kids, and so we're kind of hurt by the things that you said?
Yeah, no, I was surprised. I got a few responses along those lines too, and my heart really hurt for them. I do have friends who struggle with infertility, and I consulted with them because I wanted to know, hey guys, like, is there something to this? And a few of them were really hurt by the thought that anyone would find like a replacement in an animal, when what they really long for is a child of their own. And while you can certainly like love and give something to an animal, I think even for couples who are struggling with infertility, or for singles who haven't found their vocation yet, you know, God has other avenues of self-giving that are a higher calling than simply owning and caring for an animal. So while an infertile couple could certainly have a dog that they cherish and love, I hope they're also investing their life in like a niece or a nephew or a student who they're mentoring. Not because like they owe it if they're not having their own kids, but because there's something very innate to the human person that they need to love in that way if they're called to the vocation of marriage.
Yeah, I think it's very telling about people and their desire to love. You know, it's like something that's and relate to somebody too, right? And I think sometimes it's like almost people are afraid, you know?
Yeah.
And how, so I know you mentioned it briefly, but how does like contraception enter into this whole discussion, and how does it affect, you know, pets as kids and things like that, the whole idea?
Well, I think just the unique time we are in as a society, that there is this like ability for a wide spread of the population to indefinitely postpone parenthood, you know, either indefinitely or permanently. So that opens up this realm of possibility for, well, I would like to give something of myself still, but maybe in a limited amount. So, oh, a puppy or a kitten or several puppies. And I definitely had some people come straight out and say, we've chosen to have pets instead of kids, and isn't it wonderful, and it's our choice. And that kind of misses the whole point that there's an aspect to being called to, you know, married life that involves an openness to life, and not just any life, not plant life, not animal life, but human life. So there's just something missing there. And I think it also speaks a lot to the crisis of millennials who are sometimes putting off marriage, putting off that further commitment. Because of contraception, that's an option, you know? They can say like, I'm just gonna practice, and I love animals. I was like the freak in our family who brought home stray after stray, even a fox one time. So I was like my parents' worst nightmare, I'm sure, as a preteen. But there's a qualitative difference, you know.
So Jenny, how do we sort of balance that? As you're saying that it's not wrong for Catholics to have pets. I think that's an important distinction to make. But how do we go about drawing guidelines for the proper way to treat a pet? I know good Catholic families who will bring their pet along on the family vacation and have them be part of the family picture, and they consider them part of their family without going so far as to confuse the dignity of their children and their pets. So can you give us maybe some guidelines or a framework of how to think about pets in a Catholic household?
That's a great question. First of all, there's nothing wrong with putting your dog on your Christmas card. There's nothing wrong with taking a cute picture of your baby and your puppy. But being sure to communicate to your children, like, you are more important than this animal. Like, it's not your little brother. Like, I know that some things are said in jest, but words do have power. And it's important to send the right message to your children, that, you know, you have the primacy of value and of worth in our hearts. Like, you are not like the younger brother to this dog that we had before you were born. And just helping them understand that, like, the natural order of things is for humans to really have dominion over and care for animals and own them and responsibly steward them. So I think having a pet can actually be a really great way to help children understand, like, the dignity and the value of life, but don't stay there, you know, take that to the logical next step, which is that human life has a greater value and ultimately, like, an eternal end. So
absolutely, I totally agree. I think that that's the key too, and as parents with kids and things like that, I think it's important to share that distinction and to live it out too, because that's the easiest way, besides, you know, just telling somebody something. I think living it out and treating your animal a specific way, your kids a certain way, shows that there's a difference, right? So anyway, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you sharing your story with us and giving us some insight into the topic.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Stay tuned. We'll have one more story after the break.
Welcome back to Heroic Media. For our final story, women's rights activist Reggie Littlejohn is calling on the international community to speak out against China's brutal one-child policy to address China's female suicide problem. So China has an issue with suicide, particularly with females. And so it's not highly publicized, and I honestly didn't know about it till recently as well. So I think it's important for us to discuss this. And it's interesting to see what this particular women's rights activist, Reggie Littlejohn, has to say about what the cause of this is. So what were your initial thoughts?
I think the numbers behind this are just staggering.
Yes.
According to the World Health Organization, China accounts for about 1 in 4 suicides around the world. Suicide is the 5th leading cause of death in China, and the suicide rate for women is 25% higher than men. So there's clearly a big problem here. Hundreds of women in China are killing themselves every single day. What's going on here?
Yeah, what's going on?
And so Reggie Littlejohn is a women's rights activist who specializes in China, and she said that you've got a lot of things going on. You've got domestic violence, you've got discrimination where women are viewed as less important than men. And you have this one-child policy that is very brutally enforced through forced abortions, forced sterilizations. If a woman gets pregnant without the proper permit, she's dragged in. There's an abortion performed, and then mandatory sterilization. She has no say in it. And that's absolutely terrorizing women.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what Littlejohn says is the cause of all this. And it's their, I mean, it's really brutal. Like just like you were talking about. I can't imagine living somewhere where they said, oh, you can only have one child, and if we find out you're pregnant, you know, we're going to cause you, we're going to force you, we're going to drag you in and force you to have an abortion, and we're going to sterilize you. I mean, that's just horrible. Like, just thinking about that, like, happening in our society just would boggle my mind. But it's a daily thing out there in China, and hundreds, because of this, Littlejohn says that there are issues, you know, in society because of these policies, right? So she also mentioned a distrust, especially because the government apparently will send almost like spies into areas and will check on people and be and kind of, you know, expose them basically and go, oh, you're pregnant, you know, and so it's just almost like this distrust among other people in society, etc. And then, I mean, I can't imagine the trauma, especially, I mean, not to mention physically, but also mentally, that you would go through if you became pregnant and then were forced to have an abortion. And I mean, it's just very traumatizing. So it's no wonder that these women are just, who are treated so horribly in so many different ways, are just trying to find some escape, and that escape is suicide for them.
Absolutely. I've been to some hearings before Congress in D.C. about the one-child policy, and women who had undergone these forced abortions testified, and they had heartbreaking stories, and they just talked about the post-traumatic stress and the depression that they felt afterwards from what had been done to them, and how, you know, they had really truly been violated, and how their relationship with their husband suffered, and it was absolutely just horrible. And then in addition, because they can only have one child and the society values men more than women, what they have is they go out and voluntarily get abortions if they find out that they're going to have a girl, or they abandon the girls, and so women are just treated absolutely horribly. The society does not accept them. And it's estimated that between 360 and 400 million people have been killed by this policy in the last 35 years. So it's absolutely crazy. There have been some reports lately that China has loosened it up. I think a proper understanding of that would be tweaked, because it's not loosened. There are couples, depending on certain scenarios, you're allowed to have a second child, but then it's only 2, and it's only in some scenarios. So, you know, contrary to what some people think, this hasn't been lifted. The problem is not going away.
It's still alive and well today, the whole operation. And so it's also important to note that this policy was put in place about 35 years ago. And so that's why Reggie Littlejohn is talking about, like, hey, especially right now, we need to get some awareness about this situation, and, you know, because it's the 35th anniversary of this law. And we need to expose it. We need to reach out to our international leaders as they meet and call them out, you know, and tell them, you know, look, we would not expect this to be okay in all these other locations. Why are we not putting more pressure on China? Why are we not following up on you know, common decency, really, for human beings? And so it's also the 20 years ago, there was a conference where they talked about, there's a meeting where they talked about this in Beijing. It was hosted by the UN Commission on the status of women, and they outlined 12 priorities, how they could increase women's rights in China, right? And included in that was forced abortion. And it's also the 20-year anniversary of that, and I think it's important also at this time, not because of the 20-year anniversary as well as the 35-year anniversary. And at that a previous meeting 20 years ago, you know, they said, hey, we're going to do these things to fix all these things with women's rights issues in China. And nothing has happened.
Right.
And so it's really I think appropriate time to come out and say something about this and really start to push the buttons and go, listen, look, 35 years ago, 400 million people have been killed.
Right.
And 20 years ago, you said we're going to start fixing things, and nothing's happened.
Right.
And so I think it's a good time to start talking.
Absolutely. And the point that Littlejohn makes is that we need actual political will here, not just some statement saying we disagree with this. And actually, a couple of years ago, Vice President Joe Biden made a statement that really got a lot of people riled up. He was speaking about this, and he said, "Your policy has been one which I fully understand. I'm not second guessing of one child per family." So when you have the Vice President of the United States saying that he fully understands this policy and he's not second guessing it, that's basically communicating, oh, the United States is fine with this. Go ahead with these forced abortions. We're totally fine. Just keep doing it. It's not a problem.
Right.
And it is very much a problem. And this is one of the areas in which it's very pro-life and it's very pro-woman. So we can all agree, whether you're coming at this from a feminist perspective, a pro-life perspective, whatever, this is absolutely violating the rights of the women, of the children, of everybody. This is a bad policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so where are all the feminists? They should be up in arms raising awareness about this because their fellow women are being treated horribly. So, and along the lines of policy and everything, Littlejohn said that we also need to cut funding, especially for the United Nations Population Fund, because it directly, they work hand in hand with China in perpetuating all of these things. And so we need to cut funding, we need to stop, we need to stand up. And
take some action.
Take some action. Our leaders need to take action on this.
Right, absolutely.
All right, that's it for this week on Heroic Media. Please join us next week for all the up-to-date news on the pro-life issues that matter to you.
Please feel free to write to us with any comments, questions, or news tips at news@heroicmedia.org.
And please visit our website at heroicmedianews.org, where you can check out more stories like the ones we discussed on this episode.
That's it for this week. Until next time, keep us in your prayers.
God bless.